and come up. We can talk about your great book, which I have read. I should just take a moment to, first of all, congratulations. This is so exciting and fantastic. Also, the actual book itself, never mind the words, this is like a really beautiful book. It's got deckled edges, these uneven edges, super beautiful.
Yeah, for anyone that doesn't know, the deckled edge is when it has that little like jagged edge on the end, and it's. I always hope that I'll have a deckled edge, and I was very, very pleased to see this one.
And do you know what? And these things, do you know what these are called? French flaps, which is also makes it super beautiful. And so part of having a book is with the tactile experience of reading it, and it's a really beautiful.
The sniffing it, I did sniff it when it came out of the book.
Oh yeah, is that hyena or is that gorilla or what is? Because yeah.
A little bit of alligator in there.
Yes. So I thought I would actually start with, let's go check the time so we don't keep talking because I've got lots of things to say. I wanted to start at the very beginning. And your dedication actually, it says in 2003 in a writing workshop at the University of Victoria, our class got embroiled in a discussion of what is and what is not possible in fiction. You can do that in a story, someone asked. You can do whatever you want, our instructor said. So you dedicate the book to that instructor, John Gould. And which is lovely to dedicate a book to a writing instructor. But I wanted to ask you, so you can do anything you want. So I guess I want to ask you about what you did that you wanted, because and what is a novel? Because in this book, there is police interviews, transcripts from police interviews. I think my favorite part is of the formal stuff. There's a section where it's a academic dissertation, but with all of the edits and critiques by the professor who's not impressed by the writer. And there's all these different forms mixed in. There's something that relates to a symphony. There's all this, so these things that are not just straight fiction. So would you talk about what is a novel and what can it encompass?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me? Am I okay? Okay, good. So first of all, John Gould, he was my instructor at the University of Victoria 20 some odd years ago now. And he was just great. He was so wonderful and so supportive. And I was in school in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, and I had this idea in my head that in order to write a story or a novel that you were taken seriously, it had to be a particular kind of story or novel. There was, a lot of focus on Alice Munro and Margaret Atwood and all of these kinds of writers, and I really wanted to be writing strange things, but I didn't feel like I could do that at that time. I felt like I needed to write, the regular kind of realistic fiction kind of story. And it took me a long time to work out of that, and I did. I thought about that thing that John said all the time, and every single year that went by after that class, I was like, no, I want to write weird things. I want strange things to happen in my stories. So that was sort of the genesis of that. And then with this book, I sort of feel like, and you and I have talked about this before, Gary, the writer Sheila Heti once told you in a workshop that part of what a writer is doing when they are writing a novel is they are busy becoming the person that they need to be in order to finish that novel. And I feel like I've spent the last 20 years becoming the person that I needed to be in order to write this book. And part of that was learning all of the Alice Munro story or the sort of standard fiction story, and learning all the rules and then figuring out what you could do to break those rules. And when I sat down to write this one, this came out of a short story that I wrote about 10 years ago, also called Wildlife. And a long story short, I was sitting in my apartment and I was thinking about this weird idea that I had for this story about a woman who was living in an apartment beneath a pair of married hyenas who walk and talk like human beings. And I was like, okay, but it needs to make sense somehow. So these hyenas need to be, they need to be a science experiment gone wrong, or they need to have some sort of like reason for why they are the way that they are. And I was sitting there at the desk, and all of a sudden I was just like, you know what? They're just gonna walk and talk, and I'm not gonna explain why. And if people don't like it, they can buy other books at the bookstore. They don't need to buy mine. And it was such a great it was such a great feeling. And the novel itself, took a lot longer. I mean, it took the better part of 10 years after, well, yeah, that was 2015, so here we are 10 years later, and now it's actually a novel. And all through the course of writing it, there were just so many moments at which I was like, can you write a chapter as an academic paper? I don't know. I remember asking my agent about it, and she was like, I've never had anyone do that before. And I was like, well, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. And I mean, they put it in the book, so
I like that.
Jokes on them.
That's a question, not can I have like hyenas making very loud sex, which
Yeah,
happens
yeah,
a lot in
yeah,
the book
yeah,
actually, by the
they are
way.
very loud.
But it's just like, oh yeah, the hyenas is just a bit, but let's talk about the academic paper form, right? It's kind of switching, that's very sneaky.
For anybody who doesn't know, Gary not made his name, but became known for parrot sex in his first novel. So we're just continuing the theme
It's
here.
a thing, yes. Can you talk about, I know like you have a book of essays about fairy tales and exploring what fairy tales, how they can represent reality, how they carry a message, how they can represent sort of non-normative reality or outside what has been kind of the consensual idea of what values are. So you specifically were talking about disability. So I'm wondering about, this book is in that sense, it's like speculative fiction, it's a bit fairy tale-like, it's got talking animals, for example. So there's that, you're engaging with that tradition in order to explore the things that you want to explore. Can you talk about how it's also just got some dystopian elements? So there's dystopia, there's speculative fiction, there's fantasy, there's fairy tales, all of which are outside of the realistic novel. So can you speak about why you did that and what it got you?
I mean, why not?
Absolutely, yes, because it's exciting and fun and surprising and you don't know what's happening, right?
Yeah.
And it justifies hyenas.
Exactly. I think I really like, I was talking to somebody about this a couple of days ago actually, about the research process for wildlife, which was, I did actually do a lot of research on hyenas and various other animals, because there are various animals in the book. And there was always a point at which I was like, okay, for hyenas, for example, they're very matriarchal. They live in matriarchal clans, and the women, the females call the shots, and when male hyenas are 2 or 3 years old, they're kicked out of the clan and they have to go find their own place to be. And I read that and took that in, and then I was like, okay, now I'm going to run with this, and I'm going to take this research and go do something entirely wild or strange about it. So there is I find a lot of freedom in working from the base of the world that we know and things that we understand, like fairy tales, like dystopia, all these different genres, and then just being like, and now I'm just going to do whatever I want with it. And I'm going to maybe play with conventions or play with style or play with structure, and then see what the story wants to be in the course of doing that.
The fairy tale or maybe like fable-like thing is you have animals that have certain characteristics, and then you use that to explore human characteristics. So, a wolf would be sneaky, or a fox would be sneaky, and so those kinds of things. But you have hyenas, so matriarchal, and there's other, and you have an alligator.
She is an alligator.
Okay, right.
She's an alligator, not a crocodile.
Right, okay, I was just
She's very upset with that.
Right. Luckily, I get like reptile nervous, and there's a whale as well.
Yes, there is a whale in the end chapter.
Yeah. So without giving away, we'll get to the plot in a second, maybe. But those all have characteristics that you use to explore elements of humanness, aside from elements of what it is to be an animal. Can you talk about how that part of using animals is part of your way you explore what it is to be human and human relationships, I would say, especially? There were so many things that interested me as I was writing this book, and I was really interested in human behavior in the sense of like what is acceptable human behavior in the society that we live in right now, and what is deemed unacceptable behavior, right? So
the hyenas were an interesting sort of foil for that for me, because they're kind of seen as scavengers. They have this real reputation of being this animal that just kind of goes around and eats dead things. And it's really unwarranted. Like, they're really, really fascinating animals. And the reason that they have that reputation is because people saw them eating, you know, a lion's kill or something like that, and they they got an idea about how they behave in that instance. And it made me think about how we do that to our fellow human beings. We see someone behaving a certain way and we make assumptions about them, and then the whole world is structured in a very particular way as a result of that assumption. And again, the freedom of having animal narrators was I could play with that, right? I could play with the sort of expectations that we have about animals, about alligators, about all these kinds of hyenas, a whale, you know, and then use that as a way of exploring what our expectations are around behavior. And I mean, they are animals, but you know, they're also us. They're very much. I tried to not over anthropomorphize them, but I tried to imbue them with human characteristics or things that we could recognize when we do the reading, you know, on our own. See, like, oh, you know, this is a hyena, but like, I can understand why they would say that. I would feel that same way in that situation. The whale at the end, you know, is dealing with a very particular kind of grief, and I wanted that grief to reach the reader in a particular kind of way. Even though I'm talking about animals, I am actually talking about human beings. And I think the best fairy tales and the fables that we all grew up with as children, they still do that, right? Like they look at animals and they bring out the crafty fox, or you know, the tortoise and the hare. They bring out certain characteristics of the animals as a way of teaching us about ourselves. And I really, really liked that element of it, and just I had a lot of fun.
I think it also reminds us about animals the other way around. I was thinking about, you know, the story of the whale that was grieving its baby, and it was supporting the. I mean, so that is animal behavior, and that is a grieving mother. We can relate. It's regardless of the species, it's a grieving mother, and we can relate to that and feel. So this also reminds. And that's part of what you're talking about, is the relationship between humans and animals. But it also makes us think about the lives of actual animals as animals, not as stand-ins for humans. I mean, as we begin to think about what are our assumptions about, like, does a crocodile have
sexy thoughts? Yes, they do.
Yes. Okay. Right, exactly, right, yeah, or whatever, like any of those things, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, and what is the relationship between hyenas? Like, between, like, is there like between a relationship between the two, between a male and a female? How might that be, and how might we imagine that, and can we get our heads around that? You also, you in your last book, The Centaur's Wife, as well as in this, you think a lot about outsiders, people who are. They're just marginalized for sometimes physical characteristics, sometimes just because they don't fit into normative society. They're a centaur, for example. And so, and I think you said it really well, that as a result of how they are, society has built themselves around them in a way that does not include them.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been fascinated by that, and a lot of it comes from personal experience, right? Growing up, I have cerebral palsy. I grew up with a very visible limp, and I was bullied quite a bit when I was in school as a result of that. And it really, you know, sticks and stones may hurt my bones, blah, blah, blah. We tell that to kids when they're young, and, you know, we try and work our way around the way that words can really hurt, but they did really hurt, and they hurt in very particular ways. And so I always kind of carried that sense of, like, being an outsider in some way, being somebody who didn't really fit in. And I was always trying to figure out, A, how to fit in, but then also B, like, why is the world built this way? Why do we allow for a kind of situation where we're just okay with this? We're okay with certain people being treated particular ways because of characteristics that they may have or the way that they move through the world. And so in my work, I've always, even before I was writing, like my first novel was published in 2013, and it was about a man who grew wings, and some people could see the wings and some people couldn't. And it wasn't explicitly a novel about disability, but I very much, looking back now, can see that the theme is still there. Like I was still really thinking about what it means to be someone who is considered different or suddenly sees yourself as different compared to the rest of the world. And I just find it really interesting because, you know, that difference comes about as a result of the society that we build. And we keep telling these stories about people who are ostracized or people who are different, and we don't always position them in such a way as to say like they're different or ostracized because of the way that society is built. And instead of, I mean, there's lots of different ways you can approach it, right? You can say like you should celebrate what makes you different and special and unique, and absolutely that is true, but also, you know, where are we also looking at? How are we building societies? How are we teaching ourselves and our children to look at other people and not, you know, necessarily dwell on what is different, but also just to dwell on what is similar between all of us? And, you know, you can do that in nonfiction, which is what I tried to do in my book, Disfigured, where I was looking at fairy tales and how fairy tales can shape the way that we view the world. But I think there's also a particular kind of freedom that happens in fiction where you can do things like that. You can explore those kinds of issues, and you do it through a really wide lens, right? And that way it can become about a lot of different things, right? Like this book, it is very much about difference and being ostracized. It's also very much about grief, right? And it's also very much about transformation and how we as human beings transform in many different ways over the course of our lives. So I think sometimes there's a lot of room and freedom in the novel in particular, in fiction in particular, to really grapple with these kinds of questions, because you can also really be sneaky about it. You can just sort of like, you know, slide those kinds of considerations in, but then they stick with people, right? And they keep coming back to a particular image or a particular thought. Yeah, we build a lot of layers into what we do.
I would also say the novel is also about belonging too.
Yeah.
I think as much as
Much
there's outsiders, there's people who feel like they belong, and that's a really powerful connection. And there, in terms of disability, I mean, there's a. I said we'll get to the plot in a second, which we will in the next question. But there is a character who is not able to see with his glasses, and he's told he'll be closer to God if he doesn't need to be mediated through the adaptation of glasses. There's one of the characters has to wear hearing aids, and there's a one-armed cellist as well, which is amazing to have. It's also lovely to have cello here. It's in the book. And so those are just part of the world of the novel, which includes animals and many different kinds. So that to me that was I don't know if it was sneaky, but it was putting in just the range of human and non-human possibility into the book.
Yeah, and I think I mean maybe that is one of the sort of like things that will be a characteristic of my work. Certainly going forward, and you know, I would argue in the past I was tinkering with it too. That focus on difference, yes, but also like this is just a regular part of the human experience. I mean, you know, you and I are sitting here, and we're both wearing glasses, right? And it's not always that people necessarily consider that, oh, if I wear glasses, I have a disability, even though it's true, right? Like you do need. I have this assistive device that I wear on my face that, you know, allows me to participate in the world in a very particular kind of way that I would not be able to if I was not wearing this assistive device. Is it, you know, on the same sort of like spectrum of disability as other disabilities? No, it's not. But that doesn't mean that it still doesn't exist in that space. So it just seems very natural to me actually to focus on characters who have a wide range of, you know, what we would look at and say, oh, well, that's a disability, or that's, you know, that's a disability as well. Because these are just people who have particular needs, and the world of the novel is built to show how they are or are not getting those needs met. And it is another one of those things, right, that maybe it's not obvious. Certainly if you're someone who's unfamiliar with my work and you don't know about the disability angle, maybe it's not obvious on the first read, but hopefully it's something that people can read and think about and come back to again and again. Right?
Well, I mean, it's sorry, I just like how is the world adapted for it to being a hyena, and how different is, I mean, and they live it, as they navigate through the human world, how is that different than having one arm or like whatever? I mean, the world fits certain expectations, and so there are many characters in the book that fit into the world differently than those expectations.
Yeah.
Like all the animals, for one. Yeah. So that's really interesting. Okay, let's talk about the plot. Okay, so there's a boy lives under the stairs, finds out he's a wizard, and so it's really beautiful. So I guess the main thing is there's you have these amazing religious tracts that you have published. So the Prophet's Pamphlet, Latter Days, and so there is a religious movement called Latter Days in the book, and it has. Do you want to talk about what that is? And that's sort of the main spine of the book, is dealing with the belief system of Latter Days and how that relates to humans and animals.
So as I was saying, you know, the novel came out of this short story that I wrote about these hyenas, and it was just a short story that stuck in my head for a long time, and I kept thinking, you know, even though I'm not going to explain where these hyenas come from necessarily or why they are the way they are, I was interested about their history, and I was interested about, you know, when did they sort of come into the world in a way. And the way that the novel is structured, in the first chapter we meet our first main character. His name is Josiah, and he's a Scottish man who, by the way, if you get a chance to listen to the audiobook of Wildlife, please do. It is such a treat, and they have a whole cast of people that read the different chapters, and the first 2 chapters are read by Scottish or actors who are giving it Scottish accents, and it's like worth the price of admission on that.
Nothing like a Scottish religious
fanatic.
So
good. Yeah, so good. So Josiah goes as a missionary to Siberia, and he, you know, as we read through the story, like we realize that he has vision issues, and maybe also some other, you know, he talks to animals, and he's had this ability to talk to animals since he was very young. And when he's away on his mission, he meets these 2 creatures. He doesn't know that they're hyenas at first, so he just speaks of them as the creatures, and they bring him away from what turns out to be a kind of calamitous happening where the missionary area that he's in is destroyed, and they bring him back to his hometown. They go back across Europe with him, and he becomes convinced that they are messengers of God, and they are here to give him a particular message. He's not really sure yet what that message is. The hyenas aren't really sure. They're just here to sort of get him and bring him home. They are trying to figure out their own reasons for doing things, and then that sort of sets up the book. And then the next chapter follows Josiah's great niece. So each chapter is written from the perspective of a different person who interacts with the hyenas in a particular way. And it moves through time. We sort of move through various decades. And as we move through various decades and we're given the perspectives of different people, we also learn more and more about this religion that has cropped up as a result of Josiah's ministrations and his preachings. He becomes known as a prophet, and the hyenas become known as the feral disciples. And so when the book was getting ready in production, my publicity contact at Penguin Random House got on a call with me, and she was like, so I was thinking that we should really print the pamphlet and hand the pamphlet out with the book. And I was like, that sounds amazing. I am totally on board for this. So that's what they did. They created this little pamphlet and like designed it and just did a wonderful job. And they're giving it out to independent bookstores.
Okay, so starting tomorrow, we're going to go door to door, everybody.
Yeah,
We're just going to be knocking at it. So it's
and the best part about all of it is a friend of mine got her book yesterday in Toronto, and she was like, they handed me the pamphlet. She's like, and I literally thought it was religious propaganda. I almost threw it away. And I was like, this is so great. This is exactly what I want. But you know, it's so lovely. Publishing a book is always really, really wonderful because it's such a culmination of so many people working on it with you. You know, you write the story, but you also have your editor who helps you write the story, and then so many people come together to like make the book the beautiful thing that it is with its deckled edges. And it's, you know, propaganda and all of those other kinds of things. So it's been really, really lovely to see that and to see how that was important to the publisher as well in bringing the book out. And I hope that, you know, it does take on a bit of a life of its own in that way. And you never know, maybe I am starting a real religion, guys. I mean, we are actually in a church.
Okay, so lock the doors.
Yeah, nobody's getting out
Yes.
until you swear fealty to the feral disciples.
Can you talk about, because like maybe some of the ideas around religion, because the theme of, I don't know how much you want to give away, but I mean there's a theme of the ladder, and so it's like the great chain of being in the past where there's a hierarchy of life forms. So you're, you know, a snail or an amoeba, and then you can become animals, and then you can become humans, and then you can, and so on. And there is some idea play with, like, what is the ultimate? Is the animal, are animals human form, or are animals that change? Does that show that humans can change and that humans can become more than regular humans? And is there a hierarchy of values or of abilities, and that's what the ladder theme is playing around with? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Because that's sort of one of the things at play, is the various characters who are wrestling with what that means, and could that be true, or is there a hierarchy? Are people just enough? Should they be better? Should animals be better? Should people be better? All of that, all those questions.
Yeah. I mean, I was, again, thinking about disability in many ways when I was writing this, because I was thinking about particularly eugenics and how, and we can see it in other areas of the world, some that are very close to us, perhaps south of the border, and you know, some discussions that are coming out now, or you know, ramping up now, I should say, around what kinds of bodies deserve to be in particular spaces, and what kinds of bodies deserve to have recognition versus other kinds of bodies that don't. And so in the novel, there is this, building on that religion, the religion of the book, this idea that, you know, humans animals sit below humans on the hierarchy of who is good and who has what. And with these feral disciples who can speak to human beings, the idea is that the animals have been imbued with a higher kind of consciousness, because they are becoming more like human beings. But then this also means that humans, in the theology of this religion, humans are also becoming more, right? Humans are going to transcend their human selves. And there's this theme throughout of the prophet and his latter-day disciples and feral disciples having this very particular idea. They have this saying, which is whole bodies, whole selves. And they keep repeating that, and the idea through the book is that they're trying to eradicate disability in some way. Like, you're only whole and good if you are perfect in this way, perfect in these physical ways, right? And obviously I don't agree with that, and you know, it was a way of sort of exploring, what does this mean, right? And I think it can also go along with disability. It can also go to grief. I think we live in a culture, as much as we are, you know, very focused on wellness and trying to be our healthiest selves and all these kinds of things, we're also very much focused as a culture in the West on not grieving at all, or like only giving a certain amount of space and time for grief, and then just like pretending that it's not there, and that in a perfect ideal world, none of us would have anything to be sad or upset about. And I actually think that, you know, there's a lot of room for really wild and wonderful things to happen as a result of grief, and the kind of transformative power that it has in someone's life. And I wanted to explore that in the novel as well. So there are a lot of things, right, that sort of, these themes that kind of dip in and dip out in the various chapters. And it's messy in some ways, but I think messy in a really good way. Like, it's wild, you might even say. I just, again, it was a novel that I really feel like it told itself to me in some ways. Like, I was just waiting and ready, or getting to the point where I was ready to write this book, and all of this sort of wild and unpredictable and weird kind of stuff came together in ways that, you know, I really enjoyed writing it, so my hope is that people will really enjoy reading it too.
Yeah, I think it really speaks to the times, in that as much as there is this religious belief, but part of what the play and the novel is a balance between science and belief, between falling in with what the received notions are and being outside of that, and so that kind of groupthink or that kind of propaganda or cult, or all of these things are in play. So as people are negotiating what they actually think and what it really means to be, well, ultimately themselves.
Yeah.
Also, I've got a quote. We should there's, at the end, there's a one-armed cellist we talked about, which has a beautiful echo of the cellist in Sarajevo, I thought, which is really lovely. Which is so. He says, "I will play, and together we will grieve this world that we've lost. Humans will not hurt animals, and animals will not hurt humans, and we will welcome the new world we live in together." And there's something. I'm thinking about the power of art. I mean, that comes towards the end of the book. It's like, so here I am, I'm playing this it's in 2041 or something?
2041, yes.
And so it's a bit of a dystopian thing that's happening. He's saying, I can kind of console you with my one arm, I'm going to play the cello, and I'm going to console by, I guess, through the power of art. And I just thought maybe that might be a good place for us to end, for you talking about how you see art as transformative, as something as consoling, as an important thing now.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back, certainly for me, it goes back to that not even idea of grief, but like the reality of grief. And I think there's a real power in being able to just sort of sit in grief or sit with uncomfortable feelings, and to sit with pieces of art that encourage you to sit in the uncomfortable feelings. Or like there was a book written by the author Susan Cain a couple of years ago, and I forget the title of it, I'm going to remember it tonight at 3 a.m. It's about why we're drawn to sad songs, why people are drawn to listening to songs that make them sad, or instead of making them happy, or why we are sometimes drawn to art that is sad or says sad things about the world. And I think it's because there's something really powerful about knowing that you're not alone in the sadness that you feel and in the grief that you feel. And I think at the end of the book, I mean, the character, the one-armed cellist, he's gone through some things, and he's had to get back to a particular point of just being right with himself, being right with this changed version of himself and his body, and all of this. He grew up as a cellist and suddenly faced this future where he didn't know if he would be able to do that anymore, and he does get it back, but it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of growth for him, and he sort of inhabits this new space where he doesn't have the life that he used to have anymore, and he has to really become comfortable with that. And I think often we look to art, or we look to stories as a way of like pulling us out of that sad space, but there can also be a lot of power and a lot of grace in accepting and being with art that just allows you to sit in that sort of sad nature, those uncomfortable feelings, because all feelings come and go. Like, you're not going to be sad forever, regardless of the fact that the world is on fire. I mean, we are going to be obviously experiencing a lot of deep things, a lot of deep emotions, but it comes and goes. Grief ebbs and flows, and all of these strong feelings that we have as human beings. I think in our culture we really try and tamp it down a lot, almost as if we treat these really strong feelings as though they are animalistic in some way, as though they are beneath us. When I think really, what the cellist is trying to do at the end, right? He's trying to help everybody sort of transcend the barriers between their human nature and their animal nature, and just understand that those things can be one and the same. And
people, and by people I mean animals, also gather around. So it is a thing where people share together. So they are experiencing this thing together. So it is a community thing that he builds through his art. And I should say before we're going to go to questions. You said it's kind of grief and sad, but it's also hilarious and like bizarrely sexy and strange and beautifully written. And so I think that it's not just that yes, I see the sadness and the grief and can feel a witness with that, but but the experience of reading it is a kind of what art can do, because it's surprising, it's funny, it's beautifully written, it's all of these things which aren't sad. They're, whatever else is going on, they're also, to me, they're inspiring and energizing. So huzzah! I guess ultimately. So let's do some questions.
Yes, if anybody has any questions in the audience.
Does anybody?
Do we? Yes, in the back. Hi, Amy Jones.
I'm curious why hyenas? What is it about hyenas that made them, that inspired you to write a book about them, or to give them human characters?
And how come they ended up in Siberia?
I know,
Sorry, just saying.
Very weird, very weird. I mean, it's not something you see a lot. So there's this English-Mexican writer named Leonora Carrington who lived in the 20th century. And she was a surrealist writer. She wrote lots of strange short stories, and she was also a painter. And she had a short story called The Debutante, which is about a woman who is trying to get out of going to a fancy dinner party, and she happens to be speaking to a hyena, and the hyena agrees to go in her place. And it's a very dark, strange short story, but I loved it. And I remember reading it and being like, oh, that's interesting. I think I could do that. I could write about hyenas. Why not? And so I started writing this short story, and it was initially just this woman who lived in this apartment, and they had this pair of married hyenas who were above her, and I didn't know why they were married. Sometimes there's things that just happen when you're writing, and you're just like, well, yes, they're married and they talk. Big deal. And that is sort of how that came together. But the more that once I moved beyond it being a short story and knew that it was going to be a novel, I did more research into hyenas and sort of to understand them. And they're just really, really fascinating animals. Like they're so interesting, and they have such a bad rap, in part because of...
Read about hyena genitals, which you explain in the book.
Yeah. I mean,
just saying.
They're really fascinating. They are matriarchal, like I was saying. The reason that the hyena genitals is a thing is because the female hyena has a pseudo penis, which also acts as the birth canal. Like when a female hyena has its first cub, it has to go out through the pseudo penis. And many of the firstborn cubs die because they don't get enough air in the course of birthing. But so there's that, and then there's this reputation that they have as scavengers. There's this mythological, so many different mythologies around hyenas. In Africa in particular, talk about hyenas as having the capability to transform into humans and vice versa. They were these animals that were known to follow witches around when witches were going around casting curses on villages and stuff like that. And they just seem to occupy this really interesting space for me, especially the genital stuff, because people would get female and male hyenas confused, and they would assume that they could just sort of flip from one gender to the other. And it's just politically and also just emotionally, it's a really rich space, I felt, to be in this idea of this animal who is a shapeshifter, someone who maybe has a bad rap as well, and to maybe try and rehabilitate that a little, because I don't think they deserve the rap that they have gotten.
They have the laughter too, is another interesting thing that they...
Yeah.
But also that I feel like, at least in the West, they're a bit of an open signifier. It's not like having a wolf or having a fox that we have a million stories. I know there are almost stories in other traditions, but there's not so much. So it really, you can inhabit. Like this is the first book I've read with hyenas as protagonists, and now I will think of all other hyenas through the lens of these hyenas.
Barr and Kendrick would be very pleased.
Yes.
Yes. Another question. Nathaniel. They are.
Yes.
They are the villains in The Lion King. And fun fact, hyenas have incisors on the top and then
Oh, this is in the book, isn't it?
Yeah,
It is,
strong
right.
incisors on the bottom as well. And they don't have the incisors on the bottom, I believe, in The Lion King. And the reason for that is when the artists from Disney were going around trying to like figure out how to draw hyenas, they went to a hyena sanctuary, which is in Berkeley, UC Berkeley, in the hills above the campus, which is also mentioned in the book. And in that hyena sanctuary, they had actually filed the hyena's incisors down in order to make it safer for the keepers. And so now, as a result of that, people have this idea in their heads of what hyenas look like in particular, because this way of telling this story sort of like infiltrated popular culture in this way, right? So it's just a really, really interesting example for me of how the way that we tell stories does that, right? Like you give a particular story enough space and enough sort of momentum, and it will change the way that people see things in, like, for their whole entire lives. So.
Next, you're going to tell me that Disney princesses don't, and people don't look like Disney princesses.
Right?
That's the
I
next
know.
thing,
That's the
right?
next novel. Hello. Yes.
It sounds like you allowed yourself a lot of freedom in this book, and it sounds like it was for the first time. And I'm just wondering if in the writing, if any surprises cropped up because you were allowing yourself so much freedom that even you hadn't anticipated, and if they did, what were they?
I didn't anticipate the academic paper in the middle, which maybe sounds a little bit boring, but I didn't think that that was coming. And then
There's so much drama in that, as you should say, because there's a professor who's making all these comments, so there's like a dialogue all the way through.
Yeah.
So it's full of, it's not boring at all, because what he's saying is interesting, but there's this drama between the two of
Yeah.
them. So
and there was in that one in particular too, it was an interesting challenge for me, because I sort of knew, like, even though it was a surprise, it was like I arrived at the surprise and was like, oh, it's an academic, oh, of course it's an academic paper, what else would it be? And then as I was writing it, I was like, no, it can't just be a academic paper, like it also needs to read like it would in a novel. So it needs to, have some sort of momentum, but then also there needs to be something else that's going on here. And what's going on in the academic paper as you read through it is you realize that you're actually watching the author of the paper get radicalized in real time. So he sort of starts the paper, and he's like very objective, and he's trying to talk about the latter days, this cult / religious movement. And by the end of it, his professor, who has been going through and being like, why aren't you citing your sources? Like, what's going on here? I don't understand what you mean. By the end of it, his professor has sent him an email and is like, I'm a little bit worried about you because you've kind of disappeared. You're not returning my emails. So that was a surprise for sure. Like arriving at, okay, I'm going to write about this, but then it's also going to end up not being this at the end of it. It's going to be something entirely different. And it was just really, really lovely. Again, it was such a fun experience to write the book. The large bulk of it, I had this short story, and then I was sort of growing. Other little chapters were kind of growing on their way, and then it sort of built up. It had this momentum, and I ended up taking 2 weeks off of work in the summer of 2021, and probably about 50,000 words of the book. So just a little over half of the book was written in that sort of 10 to 14 day period, and I would wake up in the morning and walk the dog, and then I would come home and I would just sit down and I would write until like 9 o'clock at night. And it was really great, but I just really felt like it was a story that was telling itself to me in some ways. So that was one of the surprises, and yeah, hyenas on some level were also a surprise too, as much as I'm talking about really loving them and wanting to rehabilitate them as much as I can and all those kinds of things. It definitely was like, oh, this is not standard territory, Leduc. Okay, we're just gonna go for it and see what happens. Yes?
When you were writing your book, did you know how it was going to end, or did it just take itself where it needed to go?
It definitely took itself where it needed to go. Yeah. Which is a really interesting challenge. I think when you know how a book is going to end, it's its own kind of challenge. I am considering not really a sequel, but like an adjacent book that operates in the wildlife universe now, and I sort of know how that one's going to end, and so the question becomes like how to write that one without seeming predictable in any kind of way. But I have had other writings where I've had that opposite experience where I know how it's going to end, and it becomes that question of like, okay, how do you get there? That's where all the fun lies.
It's exciting about a sequel or something from, because part of what this does is engage in world building. You've got this whole world that you've made, and so you can tell other stories within that world. So
Yeah, I hope
that's
so.
fascinating.
Anyway.
So that it nothing to do with plot, but in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, really interesting. Are there any other questions anybody has? Or else we can just you can go and you can sit behind all those
Yes,
beautiful
I'll
red
sit
books
behind
and
the-
sign
the table and
you can ask
sign.
questions to you individually.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for sitting and listening to us natter on about this very strange, very fun time of a book of mine. There is, as you know, so much food outside. Please continue to eat. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you at the book table and talking more.
And congratulations